Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to continue our conversation on anxiety with Katie Cedeno, LPC. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to our podcast last week, definitely check in our archives for the podcast part 1 of 2 on anxiety. But today we're going to continue this conversation with Katie to find out more about what tools we can use with our kids when they're having anxiety. And we're going to talk about if our brain can be hijacked. Is there tricks that we can do that make navigating anxiety for ourselves and our kids easier? And I wanted to start with one notation before we jump into our interview with Katie. When we're talking about anxiety in this podcast, we are talking about just general anxiety, just the expected anxiety that can happen in childhood and the teenage years. And this is not about clinical anxiety. The difference between those is clinical anxiety is something that would be diagnosed by a physician or a therapist and requires some intervention. General anxiety is something that we can sometimes navigate on our own as parents. Not always, but we can use tips and tools, and a lot of times we're able to navigate through it more quickly. So there is a difference. And if you find the tools that we've used are not working or not creating enough of an impact, please reach out to your primary care or your pediatrician for advice, or to a therapist to get connected and get services. That is so important. So now to our conversation with Katie. Katie, tell us, what do you think is something that we should do when we're navigating anxiety with our kids?
The validating that feeling, just like the stop it. If I tell someone not to worry, that is a useless thing. It's well-meaning, but it's not going to change anything. And I think that everyone listening, and I know myself, and I won't speak for you, but have I said that before? Absolutely. To my kids, hey, just don't worry about that right now. Yeah. And of course there are appropriate times that we could probably say that with, this isn't the time we want to do this, but a general don't worry, it doesn't stop it. Mm-hmm. And so accepting the fact that there might be something that you don't understand that they're anxious about or why they're anxious about, but the feeling is real, regardless of if you think it's valid, or you identify with it the same way.
Yeah. Or you like it, right?
Yeah.
So I have a funny thing on the stop it. So when I started dating my husband, he had this Bob Newhart skit from years ago that is like this therapist that only takes 5 minutes and he tells everybody to stop it. Mm-hmm. Therapy is way more complicated than that, right?
It is. And it when we think about kids, we are raising them to be adults. They're not going to stay this age forever. And so we want to help them learn healthy habits and figure out ways to deal with these big things so that later on in life, when we're not there, we're having different responses to it.
Yeah, they're capable of handling it.
Rather than, potentially, I'm anxious, and so I'm just going to sit and cry, and I'm not going to go to my friend's house, or I'm not going to leave the house, whatever it may be. That is not what we want. And so teaching them that this is a manageable thing for us. I can help you deal with that. And part of that is showing in our own anxiousness. Again, we're the adults in the situation, and that is not always easy. It's not always easy to be an adult, or to model perfect behavior or good behavior. But ideally, that's what we also want to model. We want to use those I statements and feeling words ourselves. We want to model those for our kids, and then process through those different feelings that we have in a healthy way as well.
Yeah. So it might look like as a parent, when your kid's having a big feeling or they're worried about something, saying like, I'm feeling unsure
Mm,
about how to help you because I'm not sure what's happening, or I'm not sure what happened to make you feel this way. And I want to help. Right. So we can use
yes.
those messages too, or like with our teenagers, it's like, I'm feeling unsure how to help you because I don't know if you are wanting my help or you just want me to listen. Because I think that's one of the things with teenagers too, is like sometimes, and even kids, but a lot of times with teens, they just want us to listen. They just want to
Yes.
be a sounding board, but they don't actually really want our advice, right? They just want us to like, listen and be there and say, wow, this is really hard for you, to just
Mhm.
empathize with them. Okay. So let's talk about what logic is. What is the tool of logic?
A lot of times when we have worries, when we're nervous about things, it falls into one of two categories, right? Rational or irrational type thinking, and it could also be categorized as helpful or unhelpful, or productive or unproductive. And so using logic helps us piece out whether this is a helpful worry or an unhelpful worry. And
Yeah.
so we talk about the reality of a situation with a kid or teenager. Okay, how, whether it might be, how likely is this to happen? And then we can move on from there and go, okay, if this did happen, what would we do? And, I mentioned earlier, I'm always amazed at how resourceful kids are in coming up with answers to these seemingly massive worries, and they have solutions. They're incredibly resilient. We just don't think of them when we're anxious or activated. We don't think of them on our own, and so sometimes we need prompting
Yeah.
to help us with
And
that.
sometimes we can get some space from it. Like anxiety is hard because sometimes you've got to deal with it in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we can say like, hey, I really want to work with you on this, but this is something about tomorrow. Could we have dinner first and come back and talk about this? And
Absolutely.
then that way we're giving some space to kind of calm down so that we're allowing our entire brain to come back online and we're not in that anxiety brain. And so we get to problem solve through it versus when we're really anxious, like our responses are fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? So
Yep.
we don't have a lot of really great options. I mean, when it's survival, they're fantastic, but when it's everyday situations, they're not super helpful, right? Like if we have a test and we fight our teacher, probably not a great idea,
Well,
even though we're
yeah.
anxious. Yeah, does not end up well.
And I think that's an excellent point, because oftentimes we think of not discussing something or not managing something in the moment as avoidance. But sometimes it is simply not an appropriate situation. And so it is very reasonable and absolutely okay to put it on a shelf. We do want to make sure that we revisit it later, but if we're in the middle of target, we might not be able to get into a really deep conversation. Or when, that test is tomorrow and we need to sit down and study. Right now, we just need to regulate, and then we might need to manage a little bit later. So it's always something that we want to discuss, but it's also okay to shelve for a little bit of time.
I think having a comeback time is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever that is, so that everybody knows we're going to come back to this at this time, that allows the anxiety to stop alarming a little bit, right? And allows you to settle, because it's like, okay, we'll talk about that in the morning, or we're going to talk about that after dinner, or we're going to talk about that tomorrow. So then that way our brain is not constantly alarming us like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, this thing is happening, right? So another thing that works sometimes with anxiety is reframing our thoughts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So reframing it is a part of what it's doing is acknowledging maybe something that I'm saying that's unhelpful, and shifting it. So if I have a test and I'm going to do bad on that test, I am going to fail this test, and I'm repeating that over and over again in my head, that is an unhelpful thought. And so if I reframe it to, this test might be hard, but I'm going to study for it. So shifting it so that it's not automatically negative. It's not on repeat in our head in a yucky way.
Yeah. And that's a way that we can kind of hijack our brain, right?
Exactly.
To get it to do what we want, even if we don't fully believe the reframed thought yet, we can still say it. And our brain actually will start coming around to that idea of like, okay, this is hard, but I'm ready, or I'm prepared, or I did the best I can, right, to prepare for this test. So another hijackable thing that we can do our brain is breathing. Let's talk about breathing, Katie.
So breathing, when we take intentional, slow, deep breaths, the hijacking happens again. So very anxious situation, my respiration is likely to increase. That's something that fortunately I'm probably going to be able to pay attention to. I'm going to be able to visibly to notice that shift in my body, along with that increased heart rate. I can intentionally slow my breathing down. And by doing that, I am sending signals from my lungs back up to my brain saying, hey, danger is past. I can calm down now. And there's several different types of breathing that people like to use. Breathing does not work for everyone. And it is okay if it doesn't work for you. It is my number one go-to because your lungs go everywhere with you.
Yeah. So it's easily accessible.
You can always do it.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And we'll put some breathing techniques in the show notes. So check out there for more techniques on that. Let's talk about noticing patterns of behavior.
Okay. Patterns of behavior, especially just like the physical responses that we might notice in our kids, the tapping or even clenching fists when you get mad. These are going to be really helpful for parents to pay attention to. So when we notice, a bedtime is especially difficult, or they delay bedtime consistently, that we have tummy aches in the morning before school. Those are patterns that we want to pay attention to because we want to figure out what's going on. And so looking for any type of pattern like that as a parent is going to benefit our kids, but also we're going to encourage our kids to notice those patterns themselves so that they can identify areas that they struggle with. And then we can put a little bit of support. And that support might look like a conversation. That support might look like an extra hug in the morning. There's simple things that we can do, to help calm that nervous system down.
Yeah. Well, and so as like a kid, it might be like, hey, I noticed that Sunday nights are really hard, right? So noticing that Sunday nights are really hard and saying like, I notice, your stomach always hurts or it's hard to go to bed on Sundays. Can we talk about that? Like, what's going on? How can I help with this? What do you notice? Or for teenagers, maybe they have a test and they choose to not study, right? They might go out instead or spend time with friends or choose to take a shift at work instead of studying for a test that they know is really hard for them. So we can notice those things. Those are good patterns for us to notice. And sometimes our kids might reject it, right? What do we do then? What if they say, no, I didn't take that extra shift at work because I was trying to avoid studying. I'm so prepared, but they're not. What do you do?
Okay. This is an interesting one. So we're not going to argue with them necessarily here. And we're not going to get into a power struggle with, yes, you did. No, I didn't. Or potentially invalidate, because sometimes, a lot of times, we do things and we might not understand the conscious reason why we do things. And so by introducing it, hopefully we're going to get a conversation started, but we can help by setting maybe rules or, again, those supports, right? The new rule is the night before you have a test, we're going to sit down together for an hour or something like that, so that we're making sure that we can support them in those situations. And, continuing that open line of communication. What are your ideas on this one?
Well, I think it's figuring out like what's going on and what other resources they need in place. So it might be that they actually need a tutor, and them working actually help to reduce their anxiety. So they're trying to avoid the anxiety. So they're not studying because that makes them more anxious, knowing that they are not going to be prepared, right? Or supporting them by saying like, hey, I'm happy to drop you off to school early to meet with your teachers if you can coordinate that, right? To give them some control over this coming up. But I think a lot of times in those moments, arguing the nuances of what happened does not change the outcome right then. So it's more about a long-term solution. Like this is a longer end game here of we want to support them. So if they do fail this test, that's going to be a really big learning opportunity for them. And we just have to figure out how to go forward with that. Like that's not the end. And a lot of times, depending on where they are in life, teachers allow for corrections or additional support after school or in school or whatever, hitting up the resources that your school has and talking to like the school counselor or your principal or something like that, or the teacher individually, like how do we help support this student in that? Or even if your kid's having anxiety about going to school on Monday, sometimes the school can have somebody like connecting them with a friend to meet them at the door and those kind of things. So the schools can be invaluable in supporting the system as well.
And you know, going back to kind of the piece that I love that you do, the collaborative work that we can do with our children. So if I have a teenager that is saying, no, I'm not anxious and that is not why I chose to work. Again, we're not going to get into that power struggle. We're going to say what we notice though. You know, I notice that this is a pattern, right? Looking for those patterns of behavior. I notice that you're struggling in this class. What can I do to help? What can we do? What do you need? And so coming up with those solutions together, even at young ages. I think a lot of times parents forget that young children need autonomy too. Again, we're teaching them to be adults. We want them in the decision-making process, obviously within reason. We want them involved in this process so that they are learning how to deal with these situations. If I make all of these decisions for my teenager, they're not figuring out how they're supposed to be doing this. But if we talk through it together and I assist them in advocating for themselves or whatever it might be, then I'm teaching them a skill.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also if we do it for them, we might be getting it wrong.
Yes.
Right? We don't always know we think we do sometimes. I think we know exactly why they're doing things, but it may not be correct. Right? And so we need them as our partner. And if they're part of the process, the thing I love is that the follow through is so much better. So if we agree on something where they actually agree and we actually agree, then they're more likely to do their part and we're more likely to do our part, which I think is key. Well, Katie, I would like to end with you telling us, like, what do you think is your biggest takeaway from this? What do you want parents to really remember about anxiety and helping your kids navigate?
For me, there are a couple of pieces, and some apply to the kids and some maybe apply to the parents more. First of all, there is normal to this. There is expected to this, even though it might be upsetting to us, or we might not be sure how to handle it. This is a normal part of development. This is a normal part of humanity that we feel anxiety sometimes. The part as a parent, you are not going to deal with this perfectly.
Yeah.
The first time, every time, you might be doing great and then you might mess up, and that's okay. And so giving yourself grace in these situations that you might feel anxiety about is going to positively impact your child. And so working to validate them, and then again, give yourself grace when you screw it up, because you will.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Katie, so much. This conversation has been so enlightening and helpful. And I know that the parents out there are really appreciating your words of advice. I want to end with talking about some of the things that we covered to apply some of these tools into our life. One of the things that Katie mentioned was feelings are real for our kids, even if we don't understand them. I think that that's an important part. As a parent, sometimes we're like, why are you upset about this? This isn't a big deal. But for them, it is a big deal. And we as parents need to allow ourselves to understand that they may have feelings that we don't understand. Part of our job as parents is to help learn healthy habits. And by communicating about our feelings, we're developing those healthy habits. Don't forget about using I statements, which look like, I feel this when or because. I love this idea that teens often want us to listen. And as parents, sometimes we find ourselves giving a lot of feedback and not doing a very good job at stopping and actually listening. We may hear what they say, but we're not actually listening. We're listening to respond to their response instead of actually hearing what they're saying. The tool on logic can be incredibly helpful to break down the problem, start the conversation. Sometimes we need to implement breathing to slow down the process so that we can talk about it. And noticing the patterns of our kids' behaviors can help us prevent problems in the future. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your support. If you want to follow us on Facebook or Instagram or give us feedback, we would love that. Our email account is accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Please rate and subscribe to our show. If you feel like the feedback you're getting or the information is helpful, we would love to hear about it. Thank you so much for your time today. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.